The gouges in the steel were wider than a man's thumb. Sheriff Al Brody knew this because his own thumb was tracing the path of one now, the rough, torn metal snagging on the fabric of his glove. 4 of them, parallel, plowed through the roof of the minivan as if it were wet clay. The metal itself was peeled back and curled upwards, a ragged, gaping hole torn open to the flat gray sky. It looked like a giant had opened a can of soup. The wind, funneling through the nearby kettle moraine forest, whistled a low, mournful note through the shredded frame. The air smelled of gasoline, antifreeze, and something else, something musky and primal, like a wet dog that had rolled in a carcass. Brody had been a lawman for 35 years. He'd seen what trucks did to cars, what shotguns did to men, what desperation did to the human soul. He had never, in all that time, seen anything like this. This wasn't the work of a man or a machine. This was a violation of the physical world, an act of such impossible, savage strength that his mind kept rejecting it, trying to file it away under categories that no longer applied. This was something else. And the worst part, the part that made a cold knot of dread tighten in his gut, was the chillingly familiar question that echoed from a dark corner of his own family's history. Not what did this, but what kind of thing. But that was now, standing on a lonely bridge on Bray Road at the absolute end of everything he thought he knew. The whole nightmare, the unraveling of his world, had started just 24 hours earlier, with the quiet, unassuming sigh of a cardboard box and the sweet, false promise of escape. The box sighed as Brody dropped another folder into it, releasing a puff of dust that tasted of stale paper, regret, and the faint, acidic smell of decades-old coffee stains. 3 more weeks. 21 days. He counted them not like a prisoner, but like a pilgrim nearing a holy land, a place of sun and sand called Sea Breeze Palms. A glossy brochure for the condo complex lay on his desk, a splash of impossible blue against the manila-brown landscape of his office. He'd look at it sometimes, tracing the outline of a palm tree with his finger, trying to imagine the feel of warm air that didn't promise snow. It was a flimsy shield against the memories this place held, memories that clung to the corners of the room like cobwebs. Every worn spot on his chair was a long night spent worrying over a lost kid or a domestic dispute. The faint scar on the windowsill was from Sarah, who had brought him a potted geranium to brighten the place up and chipped the wood setting it down. The plant had died a month after she did. Now the silence she left behind was a constant low hum beneath the familiar drone of the police radio. It was the rhythm of a life winding down, and Brody craved the moment it would finally fade to nothing. The first crack in that oppressive quiet came at 9:17 p.m. A voice, thin and sharp with the metallic taste of terror, tore through the radio's calm. It was a girl, her words tumbling over each other, tangled in sobs. Bray Road. Of course. It was always Bray Road, the town's designated artery for folklore and teenage misadventure. Brody pinched the bridge of his nose, the skin there worn smooth from the gesture. "Calm down, miss. Dispatch, get a unit rolling. What's the situation?" he said, his voice a gravelly monotone honed by decades of dealing with chaos, real and imagined. It threw something at me," the girl shrieked, her voice peaking into static. "A deer. It was standing there in the road like a man, and it threw a dead deer at my car. Oh God, it was so big." Brody let out a weary breath. Deputy Rick Miller, whose youth afforded him an enthusiasm Brody had misplaced sometime during the Reagan administration, was already shrugging into his jacket. "Sounds like a 1054, Sheriff. You want I should take it?" A 1054. Hit an animal. The most common call in Walworth County. "No, Rick. I'll go. Finish up that impound report." Brody wanted the drive. The cold, sterile air of the cruiser was preferable to the ghosts in his office. The drive out was a familiar ritual. The town's few streetlights gave way to suffocating darkness. the headlights carving a lonely tunnel through the night. The trees along Bray Road were different. They grew closer to the asphalt, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the car, swallowing the light. It was a place that felt older and less forgiving than the rest of the county. He found the girl, Chloe, wrapped in a silver shock blanket beside her Honda Civic, which was nose down in a ditch, its hazard lights blinking a frantic, useless rhythm. The windshield was a crystalline spiderweb, and a gruesome smear of blood and coarse brown fur marred the hood. The deer itself was a crumpled, broken shape 20 yards back on the tarmac. A simple, tragic, but entirely logical scene. "You're lucky you weren't going any faster, young lady," Brody began, slipping into the practiced, calming cadence of his job. "It was standing on 2 legs, Sheriff," she whispered, her gaze locked on the tree line, her pupils dilated with something more than shock. "It wasn't no bear, it was wrong. The way it moved." Brody swept his heavy maglite beam into the woods. A wall of silent skeletal oaks returned his gaze. The blackness between them was absolute, a solid thing that seemed to push back against the light. Then the beam caught the indentations on the soft shoulder of the road. He crouched, the cold mud seeping into the knee of his uniform. They were huge, bigger than any boot, shaped like a wolf's paw but impossibly splayed. The spacing was the most disturbing part. The stride was immense, the impressions driven deep into the earth as if by something of colossal weight, taking deliberate, bipedal steps. A cold, electric prickle traced a path up his spine. It was a flicker of primal, illogical fear, an echo from a time when the world was dark and full of monsters. He crushed it instantly. "Just a big coyote, kid. See here," he said, pointing to a scuffed area. "Mangled tracks from the deer thrashing around. Happens all the time." He deliberately dragged his boot through the clearest of the prints, an act of sheer will, burying the impossibility under a layer of mundane reality. He didn't see the look Miller, who had followed him out against orders, gave the disturbed earth. It wasn't skepticism but a grim, local confirmation, a look that said he'd heard the stories from his grandmother and, unlike the sheriff, he'd listened. The quiet lasted less than an hour, a brief, false peace. The next call was from Dale Lannon, his voice, usually a laconic drawl, stretched thin and tight as a guitar string. "Al, you better get out here. Something got in with the sheep. Something bad." The scene at the Lannon farm was an abattoir under the cold, unforgiving glare of sodium vapor lights. The coppery stench of blood hung in the air, thick and cloying. A dozen sheep lay strewn across the muddy pen, their bodies ripped open with a kind of explosive, contemptuous violence. They hadn't been eaten, just disassembled. It was the sheer wastefulness that felt deeply wrong, a violation of natural law. A predator kills for food. This was a massacre, a tantrum of obscene strength. "Coyotes," Brody said, the words sounding hollow and foolish even to himself. "A whole pack of 'em must have been." Dale, his face the color of ash, shook his head. He pointed a trembling, dirt-caked finger at the gate. It was fashioned from heavy-gauge steel mesh, wired to an electric fence humming with 5,000 volts. The gate was bent grotesquely outwards, the top hinge torn from its thick wooden post, the splinters as long as his forearm. Something hadn't gotten in. It had been trapped inside and had broken its way out with terrifying ease. Miller knelt, his flashlight beam illuminating a tuft of fur snagged on a shard of twisted metal. It was long, coarse, and the color of iron filings and dried blood. "Never seen fur like that on any wolf, Al," Miller said quietly, his voice heavy with the unspoken things Havenwood residents knew not to say out loud. "My grandpa used to say, there's things out in the Kettle Moraine that were here before us, and they don't like fences." Brody grunted, a sound of pure dismissal. It was a bear. It had to be a bear. A big, freakishly strong bear that had somehow gotten trapped and panicked. It was a stretch, but it was a rational stretch, and right now, rationality was the only thing keeping the cold knot in his stomach from tightening into a fist. It was the next afternoon on that lonely bridge that his world of rational stretches finally snapped. The call came in as an abandoned vehicle, a simple roadblock. But when he arrived, when he saw the missing door, the shredded seats, and the impossibly peeled-back roof, the carefully constructed walls of his 35-year career, his entire rational worldview crumbled into dust. It was after he made the call to Miller, his voice a dry, unfamiliar rasp, that the whispers in Havenwood became a roar. The story of the missing family and the shredded minivan spread like a contagion, infecting the town with a fear that had lain dormant for generations. That evening, Miller came into Brody's office, bypassing any pleasantries. His face was pale, and he was holding a heavy, leather-bound ledger, its corners worn smooth with time and anxious hands. "Sheriff, I found this in the old evidence locker, tucked in the back of a records box from the 30s. You need to see this." It wasn't an official case file. It was a journal, the handwriting a faded, spidery script from a fountain pen. Brody's blood ran cold when he read the name on the inside cover. Sheriff Abram Brody, his own grandfather. A man he knew only from a stern, black-and-white photograph on his mother's mantelpiece. A man whose legacy he had unknowingly inherited. He took the book with numb fingers. The pages were brittle, and they smelled of dust and time and secrets. As he began to read, the decades between him and his ancestor dissolved. The entries from the autumn of 1936 described a season of terror that was a dark mirror to his own. October 12th. Another call from the Lannon farm. Old man Hemmings Lannon's father said something tore apart 3 of his best milk cows. Didn't eat a thing, just tore them up. The tracks are the same. Too big for a wolf, wrong for a bear. God help us. He read of a farmer's wagon found on Bray Road, its oak sideboard smashed to splinters, the horse team ripped apart. And there, on a brittle yellowed page, was a sketch that made his heart seize. 4 parallel claw marks raked across a drawing of a wooden plank. Beside it, a paw print identical to the one he had so arrogantly kicked gravel over just the night before. His grandfather's early entries were filled with a familiar, stubborn skepticism. But as the pages turned, the skepticism bled away, replaced by a creeping, horrified belief. November 2nd. It is a curse upon this land, a debt that comes due when the nights grow long and the harvest is in. Old man Hemlock down at the Grange says his people have stories of it. A walker between worlds, neither man nor beast. He says it remembers the blood of those who first broke this ground, who took what was not theirs. A Brody was the first to put a plow to the soil on this road. He laughed at me when I told him I carried that name. Abram hadn't solved the case. The attacks had simply stopped with the first heavy snow, and the official report blamed a transient bear, a cover-up, a lie to preserve the fragile sanity of a town. A final entry, dated years later, was written in a shaky, aged hand. It sleeps, but it always wakes. And it remembers, God forgive my family. God forgive the name of Brody. Al slammed the journal shut, the sound like a gunshot in the silent office. This wasn't just a monster loose in his county. It was an inheritance. A dark covenant signed in blood by his ancestors. The cold in his bones had nothing to do with the Wisconsin autumn. It was the chill of a generational curse, a secret kept in his own bloodline. The rational professional was dead, and in his place stood the unwilling heir to a nightmare. There was no question of calling for help. Who would he call? The state police? The FBI? What would he show them? A 70-year-old diary and a story that belonged in a penny dreadful? They'd strip him of his badge and his pension and put him in a soft-walled room. This was Havenwood's problem. It was a Brody problem. His problem. That night, Bray Road was a tunnel of absolute black, a wound in the landscape. Brody and Miller sat in the cruiser, parked just out of sight of the mangled blue minivan, which they'd left as a gruesome lure. The air in the car was thick with the scent of gun oil, stale coffee, and unspoken fear. Every rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like a footstep. Every snap of a twig in the woods was a claw on steel. "My grandma used to say you should never stop on Bray Road at night," Miller said, his voice barely a whisper. She said it belonged to something else after the sun went down. Brody just grunted, his eyes scanning the impenetrable wall of trees, his hands slick with sweat on the smooth stock of the shotgun. Hours crawled by, each tick of the dashboard clock a hammer blow in the silence. Then came the sound. It wasn't a growl or a footstep. It was a heavy, rhythmic thump, thump, like a massive heart beating deep within the earth. It grew louder, closer, a sound that vibrated up through the tires and into the floor of the cruiser, a bass note of pure dread. "There," Miller whispered, his voice cracking as he pointed. A shape detached itself from the deeper shadows, a piece of the night that moved. Miller flicked on the roof-mounted spotlight. The beam sliced through the night and found it. It stood by the abandoned minivan, one massive, clawed hand resting on the peeled-back roof as if it were an armrest. The legends, his grandfather's frantic scribblings, they had not done it justice. It was a thing that should not exist, a seamless, horrifying blend of man and wolf. It was easily 7 feet tall, standing on bent, powerful legs that ended in canine feet, the claws long and yellowed. Its torso was a slab of muscle beneath a coat of matted, iron-gray fur, patched with dirt and old blood, but the head was the purest nightmare. It was the long, tapered snout of a timber wolf, lined with fangs like ivory daggers, but set atop the broad, powerful shoulders of a man. And the eyes. They weren't the simple, reflective discs of an animal. They glowed with a dim, amber light, and they were filled with a terrifying, ancient, and malevolent intelligence. It looked at the spotlight not with fear, but with contempt. Then it turned its head, and those intelligent eyes looked directly at the cruiser. It knew they were there. It had known all along. With a sound that was not a howl but a deep, guttural roar that vibrated in their chests, it moved. It didn't run. It flowed across the asphalt, covering 50 yards in a handful of impossibly long, fluid strides. It was on them before Miller could even chamber around. The world became a storm of shattering glass and screaming metal. The creature's shoulder slammed into the passenger side, the frame of the cruiser groaning in protest as the door caved in on Miller. A long, black-clawed arm shot through the broken window, seizing the deputy by his jacket and dragging him, screaming, halfway out into the night. Brody reacted on pure, screaming instinct. He raised the 12-gauge and fired, the blast a deafening thunderclap inside the car. The heavy slug hit the beast in its side, staggering it with a grunt of pain and fury. It dropped Miller, who collapsed onto the road, his arm a mangled mess of torn fabric and blood, the creature's amber eyes, now burning with white-hot rage, fixed on Brody. It tore his door from its hinges, as if it were made of tinfoil, and lunged. Brody threw himself out the passenger side, scrambling over Miller's inert form. He fired again, the shot going wide as he stumbled back. The beast was circling the ruined cruiser, its movements unnervingly deliberate. It wasn't a rampaging animal. It was a hunter, toying with its prey. His shotgun felt like a child's toy. He fumbled in the trunk, his hands shaking so violently he could barely close them around the cold cylinder of a road flare, a half-forgotten tool from a life that no longer existed. He ripped the cap off, struck the igniter, and a blinding, hissing fountain of chemical red light erupted in his hand. The beast recoiled, raising a clawed hand to shield its intelligent eyes. It snarled, a sound of pain and frustration. It was his only chance. Brody hurled the flare straight at its face. As it flinched away, blinded and furious, he leveled the shotgun and methodically fired his last 2 slugs into the center of its chest. The impacts threw the creature back a step, then another. It stood there for a long second, swaying, a low moan rumbling in its throat. It looked down at the dark, spreading wounds, then back at Brody, and in its eyes, he saw not defeat, but a promise of return. Then, with a speed that defied its injuries, It turned and melted back into the absolute darkness of the Kettle Moraine forest. Dawn broke over a scene of quiet carnage. The cruiser was a wreck. A trail of thick, blackish blood led into the woods for 100 yards before simply stopping, as if the creature had been swallowed by the earth itself. Miller was alive. In the days that followed, Sheriff Brody wrote the final, and most important, report of his career. He dictated the words slowly, the bureaucratic language tasting like ash in his mouth. Unusually aggressive Ursine subject provoked attack, subject wounded and driven off. It was a flimsy, pathetic lie, but it was a lie the world could live with. Havenwood returned to its quiet rhythm, the horror on Bray Road slowly transforming back into a spooky story, a cautionary tale to keep kids from parking in the woods. On his last day, Brody handed his badge to the new sheriff. He didn't offer any special warnings. Some knowledge was a burden you could not share. He packed the last of his things, but when he got in his truck, he didn't turn south. The Florida brochure was still on the passenger seat, its glossy blue promising a life that was now an impossible fantasy. He drove to the old Brody homestead on the edge of town, a place he hadn't set foot in since his mother's funeral. The air inside was stale with the smell of dust and time. He walked through the ghostly, sheet-covered rooms and into the study. There, he opened the cardboard box from his office. He didn't take out the brochure for sea breeze palms. He took out his grandfather's journal and placed it on the old oak desk. Beside it, he placed a single, heavy shotgun shell, one he'd found in his grandfather's desk drawer, its brass casing tarnished with age, its slug cast from what looked like melted-down silver. He had not escaped. He had come home. His retirement was not an end. It was the beginning of his true watch. He looked out the window, past the harvested fields, to the dark, waiting tree line of Bray Road. The beast was wounded, not dead. The debt his family owed this land was not yet paid in full. The cycle was not broken. He was just the next link in the chain, a weary old man standing guard at the edge of the world, forever listening for a heartbeat in the dark. The archives are now closed for the night. For more files unsealed from the shadows of American history, subscribe to the Folklore Archives. Your next case file is just one click away.